Berlin ist mir eigentlich sehr fremd und eines der ersten Dinge, die ich heute früh gesehen habe.
One of the first things I did this morning was to see a Litvas advertising column, an indication of how you should research into Berlin. I'm not a Berlin, by the way. I'm not very familiar with the city. All the highlights of the city using a flat rate ticket. So what I want to present to you is something completely different, just ticking things off on a list of sites.
Sämtliche Punkte dieser Konferenz, das ist von Kultur über Entrepreneurship.
Talking about cultural entrepreneurship here, after all, ethics and travel, has nothing to do with ticking off boxes on a list. My name is Reiner Luyken, and for the past 35 years, I've been living on a peninsula off the coast of Scotland, right up in the north, and I'm a lateral entrant into tourism. My wife and I began this venture about 7 years ago. We thought it's time for us to begin something new in our middle age. After all, we've gone living forever. And we'd had a bit of land for quite some time, almost part and parcel of the way that we live there, and a plot of this land was completely unusable. So we thought to ourselves, well, what can we do with this? There was a hill. In fact, it's still a hill up above the sea with a wonderful view in one of the tremendous stretches of landscape, one of the best in the world, if you ask me. I said this to somebody in Zimbabwe, whom I had dinner with, and that was a wonderful area with the buffaloes in the water, at the river. And the sun went down behind the hills, and I said, this is the second most attractive piece of scenery in the world. And he said that somebody else who visited me said exactly the same thing. There was somebody talking about South America. Anyway, to come to the point, it's a national scenic area in Scotland, a nature conservation area, if you like. A peninsula about half the size of the city of Bremen, 300 inhabitants, surrounded by hills and mountains with all sorts of odd different shapes and sizes. And from the hill that we have, all that you can see basically are the sea, the hills and greenery. Anyway, all this plot of land was covered with thorns and ferns and, well, basically there's nothing you could do with it. It was a bit marshy, a bit boggy. And we thought to ourselves, well, perhaps we should try and build something here. But the question was, what? What can you possibly build on a plot of land like that? That would stand out in the landscape, if you like, but there at the same time be appropriate to the landscape, but not mar the landscape in any way. And it was 2007, if I remember correctly, we went to the Hebrides and we saw two little houses there with a grass-covered roof, almost as appeared beneath it, and we thought, yeah, that's it. That's exactly what we got to build. So we went to see the people and said who was the architect, and they gave us a telephone number, gave them a ring to contact the architect and said, okay, we would like to see your plans and sketches for this hillside building. And then he came across to see us and gave us more precise instructions. And this brings me to the name of our project. They're called the Brochs. The Brochs are odd structures off the northwest coast of Ireland, built in the Iron Age. In the Outer Hebrides, on the Shetland Islands, and also on the Orkney Islands. And there are all sorts of different views as to what these broths really were. Some people say they were defensive towers, others say they were probably farms, farmsteads belonging to prosperous people. There are all sorts of books about this, but there's no really general agreement apart from the fact that these constructions date from the Iron Age, and those that have survived, they were complete ruins or in a semi-ruinous state. On the peninsula where we live, there is also a ruin, but there's almost nothing left apart from the foundations. And many of the broches are in a semi-ruinous state, covered over by grass, which gives them a very odd, timeless character. And we said to the architect, we would like you to produce plans that will enable us to reflect this concept of the broches. And he produced some absolutely superb plans. Then we started building. In the area where we live, I think that up to the 1920s, all the houses were built of dry stone, and then concrete and cement took over, and out in the countryside, natural stone would continue to be used for a longer period. So there is a tradition that we could draw on here, but not on the scale that we wanted to have. But there again, we had people in the vicinity who were really astonishingly creative in contributing to the construction of these buildings. We have dry stone walls 4 meters high, 1 meter thick, so really quite extensive. And the houses are, I feel like, circular in shape, jutting out from the hillside. And the roof is grass covered, but we've taken the sods of grass from the field, surrounding field, so all what we have there on the roof are natural products, if you like, what's grown in the vicinity. And basically the building of this structure in itself was the first step towards the realization of what it was that we had in mind. First of all, we wanted to construct something that we would love, that we would really worship. And we wanted the people who worked with us, the building workers, the excavators, the carpenters and so on. I was in charge of the project. I'm originally a craftsman by trade, so that was quite familiar to me. And then I said from the very outset, okay, we got the plans, we had the architect, but from that point on we said, okay, this is our idea, and we're going to put it into practice. Now we've got everything else in place. So for a period of 2 years, we had 12 people working for us, and now everybody can see their work reflected in the finished product. The buildings were completed after a 3-year construction period. There was the planning phase. That was a bit tricky. Guests we've had have always asked us why this lasted so long. Was the planning authorities that posed such a problem? But no. On the contrary, they were very much in favor and gave us every encouragement. And ultimately, something developed that really was considered to be something that was highly controversial in the region as such. Attracted a great deal of interest. And, well, of course, there was opposition. Some people didn't want to have this built at all. And then the question was, okay, why were they opposed? Yeah, well, it's difficult to say, because in the meantime, everything, what's all become fully integrated into the landscape, is very well adjusted, fits in very well. But if you want to see something like this through to the very end, you've got to overcome resistance en route. If you're doing something unorthodox, unusual. Anyway, what you can see of the buildings today are these grass-covered roofs and the dry stone walls using natural stone. There was old Victorian pier in the vicinity that we plundered to use the lentils and other things. There are these little snails that were on the remains of the pier, and the old bolts, these old Victorian bolts that were used to stabilize the pier supporting structure. That's what we brought along with us and inserted. We had the windows built as well, built from elements of an old Victorian wooden warehouse, and we used this material as well, and had the windows built of this. So what we have is a great deal of recycled materials. Now, the second feature is that we have linked everything with cultural aspects. So we've had, from the very outset, contemporary Scottish art collected. Well, in fact, I began that much earlier on. Now, inside these houses are very modern, very contemporary, but basically they're almost like museums. There are so many contemporary works of art displayed. Some of the best contemporary Scottish artists have their works displayed there. And somebody asked me recently, are those all your pictures? And I said, yes, of course. Well, there's John Bellamy, with plenty of pictures of his. Got a major exhibition going on in the DIE exhibition in Edinburgh. He's just turned 70. But you can put a good collection together if you have the relevant funds and interest. So that's the cultural aspect. Then, of course, there's the natural aspect which comes into play as well. Already addressed that with regard to the way the houses have been built. But then another aspect is the natural environment which is there in itself. Mention has been made of dolphins and whales. That's not an everyday occurrence, but they pop up every now and then. We had a dead whale washed onto the shore, onto a bay just a couple of years ago. And there were the bones and the ribs that were washed ashore, which we were able to use in part in the building. And then in earlier days, when dead whales were washed ashore, they used absolutely everything. Oil, blubber, or whatever you could lay your hands on and turn to good use. And we have sea eagles, other eagles, and birds, which are quite rare in the region. And as a tourist entrepreneur, you've got to be quite careful, because people want to see everything, of course. So just recently, a hiking path was laid out in a very informal manner across the hills behind our houses, in a very bare, windswept landscape, but a way too bit of a struggle against others, against the local administration, to make sure that the path should be moved away from a small lake, because I know that a black-throated diver is there. We've got red-throated divers and great northern divers as well. And in this particular region, the whole population is of Great Britain is represented. I think the 1,500 breeding pairs, and there are several dozen of the great northern divers. And they're very shy, very sensitive, and they don't want people around them. So on the one hand, we want people to be able to see things, but on the other hand, what's more important, and ultimately I succeeded having the path rerouted so that people can't then see the birds breeding or rearing their young. But we've set up telescopes, so there's a certain conflict that can arise. You have to be careful to ensure that you don't really undermine what is really so magnificent there, because ultimately people come to see and experience the landscape from morning to night. I've got a Facebook site on which I upload new photos, but you can't do the same thing all the time. You can't just do landscape photos all the time. Sometimes I report about people in the village or about animals or this, that, and the other. Then you can see how many people have clicked and had a look at things and how many people they've passed it on to. And it's the landscape that's... to come back to the issue of art, I thought this would be a source of attraction to get people in, but I should point out that that's not the case. People do not come to see the art, but to experience the landscape. But if they are there, and they do find that the art is a great source of attraction, afterwards they say, oh, it's fantastic to be able to look at all these pictures. And of course we've got art books with information about the painters who are represented in the houses. And this is greatly appreciated, goes down very well after the event, as it were. So it has a sort of educational effect. Sounds a bit pedagogical, but be that as it may. You try to pass on what's important to you, and other people then understand what this means. But perhaps I can just mention one other thing in conclusion, is what I think is very, very important as an entrepreneur, is that you get the relevant sponsorship in. What's been said about social responsibility is certainly very, very important. There are 4 different sponsorship schemes that we have. One is an old traditional sailing boat. Another is for, well, there's 2 art sponsorships, if you like, an arts centre in a port town in the vicinity. There's another one that also has to do with art. And the 4th one has to do with music. It's a music competition and support for that. So we're talking about sums that aren't huge, but compared to our turnover, I would say that we're talking about 2 to 3% per year that we provide in terms of sponsorship support. And that basically, I think, is something that forms part and parcel of your activities as an entrepreneur. If you're in charge of a company or a firm that is doing well commercially, like our